Something you hear again and again about the value of reading literature is that it fosters empathy. That the reason it is so powerful and so necessary is because it helps you understand the point of view of others. I've said this myself, I'm sure, on this channel at some point, and when studies come out that purport to prove this, the literary world rejoices. But I am not sure if this is actually true. If we look back at history, for example, some of the most literary societies in the world were also perpetuating some of the worst injustices. And even in online discourse now, the subject of readers not being able to relate to characters, particularly white readers being unable to relate to characters of colour, is a common criticism levelled at books. Surely, if reading fosters empathy, this wouldn't be an issue. On top of whether it is true or not that reading fosters empathy, what is the reason behind the constant insistence that it is so? There often seems to be an odd mix of superiority and defensiveness in such arguments. A pose of being deeper and more sensitive that exists for readers, introverts, certain results of online personality quizzes the internet over. And the defensiveness is a need to rebut the argument of those productivity nutters who tend to look down on fiction, particularly the kind of fiction mostly read by young women. An argument that has to be met with a "but the science says" kind of an argument, when I feel what we really need to be doing is rejecting the premise entirely. Reading can be powerful, but does it need to be? Now, I have been planning this video for a while, but recently With Cindy did a similar video titled "Will Reading Make You a Better Person?" I'll leave it linked in the cards above. I think some of my points are going to coincide with what she said in that video. We did read some of the same books, after all. And her video is definitely worth a watch, but I am going to be focusing on the idea of empathy specifically. Does reading build empathy? How is this played out in the real world? And why do we need fiction to be good for us? Rather than the more general concept of being a better person. It does show me, though, that I should definitely stop wasting time and get on with it when I have an idea for a video. So, what do the researchers say about reading and empathy? In an experiment in 2013, researchers David Comikid and Emanuele Castano did 5 experiments to test if reading increased people's theory of mind, which is the ability to understand that other people have their own mental states, including desires, beliefs, and intentions, which may differ from our own. They did this by having people read genre fiction, literary fiction, or nothing at all for the control, and then tested whether they could see what people's emotions were based on pictures of their eyes only, which is really specific, but let's go with it. While some of these experiments had results with no statistical significance or could not be replicated by other researchers, some showed a slight improvement in theory of mind for those who read the literary fiction passages. So, 1 point for literary fiction. It is theorised that this is because genre fiction offers more formulaic characters and social situations as plot is the main focus in comparison to the complex characters of literary fiction. However, in the experiments in relation to moral judgments, results were more mixed, and there was significant variability between studies. A subsequent correlational study also suggested that a lifetime exposure to fiction positively predicts the theory of mind performance. There is also limited evidence, for example, that reading can increase helping behaviour, Johnson, 2012, and empathy, Ball and Veldkamp, 2013, reduce prejudice, Johnson, Jasper, Griffin and Huffman, 2013, foster openness to ambiguity, Jikic, Oatley, Moldovano, 2013, and alter self-perception, Jikic, Oatley and Carland, 2012. All of this suggests that while there is a temporary limited improvement to theory of mind after reading literary fiction, and that longer-term readers tend to have stronger performance on theory of mind tests, there is no evidence that this is a permanent improvement or anything beyond correlational in the long-term studies. And those studies cannot be separated for other sociocultural factors that would cause someone to be a long-term reader in the first place. There is also some evidence for other aspects of empathy, such as helping behaviours and a reduction of prejudice, but this evidence is limited and further research is needed. And other scientists describe the theory of mind test used in these experiments as a bit odd, with Philip Davis, a professor of psychological sciences at Liverpool University, stating, "Testing people's ability to read faces is a bit odd. The thing about novels is they give you a view of an inner world that's not on show." Even though the study only measured extremely short-term benefits of limited exposure to literary fiction, it was largely taken to stand in for a wider truth about the morally improving effects of the stuff. The notion that it makes you a better, more empathetic person. But I would argue that it is not strong evidence for the real-world improvement in empathy caused by reading. And I think if we look at the real world outside of a short-term scientific study, the argument that readers are more empathetic than other people falls down pretty quickly. Take, for example, the literary cultures with which I am most familiar in terms of the classics, the 19th century world of the UK and the US. Between 1851 and 1900, there was a rise in British male literacy from 69.3% to 97.2%, while for the female part of the population, the improvement in literary rates was even more pronounced, from 54.8% to 96.8%, with similar rises across the US, although that varies more strongly by region and, of course, by race, which is kind of my point. The UK introduced free compulsory education to the age of 11 in the 19th century, which contributed to this rise in literacy. And many of our most famous Anglophone writers, from Charles Dickens and Emily Bronte to Mark Twain and Edith Wharton, were writing at this time. And yet, these are hardly cultures famed for their empathy. Slavery was outlawed in the British Empire in 1837 and in the US in 1865. But life did not suddenly become wonderful for formerly enslaved people after this. Both of these countries spent the 19th century expanding their empires. Britain was involved in the scramble for Africa with France, Italy, Germany, Spain, Portugal, and Belgium, all also very literary societies with writers of their own canon writing at that time, between the 1800s and the start of World War I. And the US spent 1898 to 1902 in a brutal war subjugating the people of the Philippines, showing that even by the end of this century of literary explosion, the political world of these two countries was no more empathetic to people from other countries than it had been at the height of slavery at the beginning of the century. Elaine Castillo, in her work How to Read Now, talks about this idea that fiction builds empathy comes from a colonial practice. The idea that colonial whites back home could learn about their more subjugated peoples via the heavily biased data transmitted through their dubiously gathered folklore has a corollary in the contemporary practice of reading writers of colour to learn more about whatever traffic slide of history has become most recently relevant to that readership. Education and empathy become resources to mine, not ongoing practices to question and transform one's life, one's work, one's adjacency to power. This was an idea first introduced to me by Professor Hannah McGregor in her work A Sentimental Education, in which she says, "Here's the thing, any generalised belief that reading makes people better or less racist or more compassionate falls apart as soon as we look at the political actions of highly literate cultures. There's just no evidence that supports this idea." I realise she's talking about compassion and racism here, but if empathy is not related to compassion and is not supposed to be making us less racist, then what is it? In 2021, a young man was caught with thousands of pages of white supremacist materials, how-to guides for making a bomb, and neo-Nazi manifestos. The judge ruled that instead of going to jail, the man should read the classics of British literature, such as Shakespeare, Dickens, Austen, and Hardy. The neo-Nazi did the reading, and then continued to be a neo-Nazi. Reading the classics of literature did not create empathy or reduce racism in this young man. Of course, he was reading Charles Dickens, who is famous for his anti-Semitism, but still. The judge was perpetuating what Jennifer Wilson called the empathy industrial complex, the logical conclusion of the typographical wall art style idea that stories are empathy generators, or as Jonathan Hari, a famous pop psychologist, said, a kind of empathy gin. As Lyta Gould writes in her book, A Dangerous Fiction, if reading novels increases empathy, then the publishing industry ought to be full of the kindest, most empathetic people alive, instead of being a legendary hotbed of personal cruelty, misogyny, racism, and low wages for writers. I think I have, at the very least, problematised the idea that fiction is inherently empathy building in this video so far. But one of the things that most interests me is, why is this such a pervasive idea? Why do we need reading fiction to be beneficial, to be a form of self-improvement and also good for society as a whole? And especially considering the metaphors used of the empathy gym, what are the connections with the productivity and wellness culture? Reading fiction is a pastime that has been both lionised and denigrated. Whether it is the 19th century mocking of young women for reading novels instead of sermons, or the contemporary productivity bros who do self-flagellating challenges in which reading non-fiction is the only reading allowed. Fiction, and particularly its connection with women, has regularly been seen as unserious and unimportant. And as Margaret Ann Doty talks about in The True Story of the Novel, as soon as fiction became more readily available, it became necessary to defend fiction. A certain guilt became attached to reading stories. stories. Literature was then expected to teach moral lessons and good values, leading to the rise of sentimental novels such as Little Women and Uncle Tom's Cabin, earlier examples of which were satirised by Jane Austen in her novel Sense and Sensibility. In order for fiction to be considered valuable, it must, for some, prove that it is worthwhile work, that it improves our minds and our morality in order to avoid the sin of self-indulgence and simply having fun. Calvinist theology and the Protestant work ethic strike again, removing the simple pleasure from literature and instead turning it into a gym that exists for you, to fix you, to always be optimizing. The same argument continues today with the defence of the humanities against those who wish to turn us all into STEM robots. Not that all STEM students are robots, but this kind of capitalist logic wishes that we were. Humanities are defended as being good for you, the same kind of empathy gym, and as teaching critical thinking skills, which I'm not sure they do on their own. This argument is not provable empirically, and it is also a weak one set against the more obvious financial benefits of learning engineering or accountancy. It falls into the trap of ceding the argumentative ground to your opponent, defending fiction reading for what it can do to an individual who takes it as medicine, for the ways that it can spit out productive and useful members of society. Rather than reading makes us more human, isn't it easier to argue that we read because we are human? It is also inherently self-centering and individualistic, making the whole point of the existence of fiction the improvement of you as a person, or performing the simplistic Barbie movie fix of one talking to being enough to snap you out of whatever daze the world has put you in. And this connects to my next point. Another argument for why fiction needs to be good and moral, growing our empathy muscles and teaching us ethics, falls into this idea of reading as a political act. I am going to have to tread carefully here because there are two well-drawn sides to this argument, and I don't really want to be seen to be on either side. I actually think the liberal side here is falling into a similar trap I mentioned a second ago, so I'm aiming for nuance here, so please go with me. One of the go-to arguments for the power of fiction is the lofty claim that fiction can change the world by revealing what is true, changing minds and inspiring political action through the development of empathy. As I said, the idea of changing the world one mind at a time. The idea that fiction is powerful and therefore dangerous is one that exists across the political spectrum, from book bans and burnings on the right, the critiques of harmful fiction by the more socially liberal. I won't say left because I don't think the left are as concerned about this as the liberal centre. The left, in my experience, has more arguments about right theory than about fiction. Of course, discussions about how harmful certain books may be is in no way the same thing as book banning, particularly books by black and queer people. But the impulse behind the argument is the same. Books are powerful and therefore dangerous for other people who might be brainwashed by them, not for me. And those other people tend to be children and women. And this is a bigger discussion about the paternalistic impulses in politics, which I'm not properly going to go into here, and who gets to regulate what. But the argument itself is not a new one. Plato talked about the danger of stories in which the gods and heroes behave badly, because readers would emulate the heroes and the gods. We must put a stop to such stories, his version of Socrates declares, lest they produce in the youth a strong inclination to do bad things. But if we look outside, it is hard to see any places where fiction has had a real impact on world events. People receive information from all sorts of sources, and much art that has demonstrably and obviously political messaging has very little real-world effect on events. Just ask Billy Bragg. The example that is often brought up is Uncle Tom's Cabin and the abolitionist movement in the US. Harriet Beecher Stowe appealed to a white woman's claim to such a caring nature in order to make them see the humanity in black people. I read James Baldwin's Everybody's Protest novel on this topic, and I really urge anyone to read it. It's an essay, so it's not that long, and I could just quote the entirety of it for my argument, but I will stick to just one paragraph for the most part. The protest novel, so far from being disturbing, is an accepted and comforting aspect of the American scene, ratifying that framework we believe to be so necessary. Whatever unsettling questions are raised are evanescent, titillating, remote, for this has nothing to do with us. It is safely ensconced in the social arena, where indeed it has nothing to do with anyone. So that finally we receive a very definite thrill of virtue from the fact that we are reading such a book at all. This report from the pit reassures us of its reality and its darkness and of our own salvation. And as long as such books are being published, an American liberal once said to me, everything will be all right. Uncle Tom's Cabin has often been said to be teaching white people that black people are human, but as Baldwin argues, it does so by making two people who are as white as possible to be while still being considered black, the people that we empathise with, while the other black people are simply caricatures. What it mainly cares about is saving white souls and titillating white people with violence against black people. Baldwin again. Her laudable determination to flinch from nothing in presenting the complete picture, an explanation which falters only if we pause to ask whether or not her picture is indeed complete. How is it that we are so loath to make a further journey than that made by Mrs. Stowe, to discover and reveal something a little closer to the truth? This is not a video about Uncle Tom's Cabin, but as a representation, its effect on abolition cannot be removed from the direction in which political momentum was going at the time, and the real-world effects of the novel specifically are unprovable. I would rather argue that rather than changing the world, fiction is speaking to a moment or a perspective. It is exploring through story the world in which we currently live, with its present politics and present concerns. It is a mirror, and mostly one person's introspection on what that could mean. Rather than driving or instilling ideas, the power of fiction is that it reflects, allowing you, the reader, to know that you are not alone in perceiving the world a certain way, and perhaps wanting to change that. Perhaps you would argue that reading can change minds, or one mind at a time, a la Barbie, but mostly, I don't think that's true. I recently read a tweet that said, "Every time the I don't look at the author, I just read what I like thing comes up, I'm reminded of the Devil Wears Prada monologue. You think you're just reading what you like, but the truth is the entire system has been carefully orchestrated to get that book into your hands. Most people are only reading books that they already agree with, and if it is changing their mind, it is only slightly in a direction that they were already headed. Getting a complete 180 from a novel, I don't think that's happening. And the people whose minds need to change are, for the most part, not picking up the book in the first place. A few years ago, there was online a book community drama about some reviews of Babel by R.F. Kuang. I didn't like that book, but these reviews argued that it was racist against white people instead of a critique of colonialism. And these reviews naturally caused backlash from other readers. Those two readers were not led by Babel to consider the perspective of colonized peoples and the violence inherent in the colonial system. They just took against it. This despite it being the most obvious and heavy-handed moral possible. Even then, some people can't see what's right in front of them. Only people who already agreed with the premise liked the book. I personally don't disagree with the premise, but I disliked the execution. Sure, you can maybe learn some new things from fiction, but lack of political action in general doesn't come from ignorance. Prejudice and harm do not come from ignorance, but from the material benefit that those perpetuating harm or having a laissez-faire attitude gain. It'd be so easy if reading the right books in the right way could alter the structure of the world in which we live and lead us to equality, but that in itself is a comforting fiction. All this is not to say that reading is not political at all, and this is where the nuance I mentioned comes in. There is much sanctimonious writing on depoliticizing art, and much social media whining about bringing politics into fiction. But of course, as I said, all books are written in and about their moment. Even when they are historical fiction, or sci-fi, or fantasy, writers are embedded in their lived experience and cannot escape from their subjective reality. And this leaks into their work. All art is political, whether overtly or obliquely, and the kind of deep reading that assesses this is not an aberration, but true engagement. As Elaine Castillo wrote, "It is a political choice to protect and continue to narrowly read certain writers, while willfully ignoring parts of their oeuvre. It is a political choice to declare that not reading writers for their politics, or protesting about the Nobel's legitimizing of their work, is tantamount to a foreclosure of readerly curiosity and openness. And not, for example, consider that it might be equally incurious of a reader to vociferously defend the right to read supposedly non-political white European men, and not seek out the chance to make space on one's shelf for the apparently inherently politicized everyone else. It's a political choice to say that certain artists make real art that must be protected, and other artists, seemingly always writers of colour, queer writers, minoritized writers, make only socialist realism or sentimentalist dogma." So my arguing that reading is not a political act does not negate the fact that reading and fiction are political. They always are, and the wider structural question of whose voices are promoted and published are too, obviously. But if reading is all you are doing for your politics, you're not really doing anything at all. Okay. So what if reading only tangentially enhances empathy? And so what if it's not a political act in and of itself? Fiction is powerful. It can have a profound effect on people. So what does it matter if we exaggerate what it can do? Well, I would be hypocritical if I were to argue that people need protecting from these arguments because they can't see beyond them. But I would say that the dangers of such arguments, or at least the problems with them, is that they can be weaponized in ways that people might not necessarily agree with. As I mentioned earlier, the argument that books can have a powerful influence over people's thoughts and ideas can give license to the plans to ban certain books for the harms that can come from them. If books can change a person fundamentally, then of course people are going to want to police the ways in which they do that. And of course, this is much harsher with conservative book bans, which have, particularly in the United States, removed access to certain books across certain parts of the country than it is in terms of cancel culture, which has, at worst, cancelled a handful of people's publishing contracts. But as I said, it springs from the same idea of what stories can do and therefore how they should be regulated. Just because you agree with the people regulating them in certain circumstances doesn't mean that censorship is necessarily the right idea. And it weakens any argument when you disagree with the person doing the censorship. Ellen O, our founder of We Need Diverse Books, made this exact argument in 2022 at the School Library Journal Summit. Everyone in this room knows how powerful books are. It's why there are so many attempts to ban them, censor them, burn them. Books contain knowledge, books teach empathy, books open us up to new worlds and thoughts and lives. If racism and bigotry are not taught in the classroom, if books about marginalised kids are censored and unavailable, we risk creating a generation of kids who have never learned the true meaning of empathy, that never learned the true shameful history of this country, and who will repeat the atrocities of the past. But as I've already argued, I don't believe that bigoted people reading diverse books will have a great deal of impact in the real world. It is measurably effective for marginalised children to see themselves represented in the books that they read. And everyone deserves to have good, bad, and indifferent fictional characters in which they can see reflected multifaceted versions of themselves. And this part of diversifying, especially school curricula and libraries, is a very real good. When it comes to the racism gym, it is a repetition of the argument that we can simply overcome racism, misogyny, homophobia, etc. by reading the right books in the right ways. Because those things are merely ignorance and bad thoughts, and not a system by which people materially benefit regardless of how many books they've read. The other negative of instrumentalizing books in this way is that it is always writers of colours whose works are your medicine, and those of a dominant group that can be escapist art for art's sake. As Elaine Castillo says in How to Read Now, the concept of instrumentalizing fiction or art as a kind of ethical protein shake, such that reading more and more diversely will somehow build the muscles in us that will help us see other people as human, makes a kind of superficial sense and has a superficial effect. The problem with this type of reading is that in its practical application, usually readers are encouraged, by well-meaning teachers and lazy publishing copy, to read writers of a demographic minority in order to learn things, which is to say, as a supplement for their empathy muscles. The result is that we largely end up going to writers of colour to learn the specific, and go to white writers to feel the universal. This is because publishing, which is a mostly white industry, presumes itself to be the readers of the work. And so what ends up being published most often is what is palatable for a white audience, which in this case means both the prurient and self-flagellatory trauma narrative. I cannot say that word. We, as the bookish community, expect writers of colour to teach us something in order to be important and relevant. As Book Chats with Shelley said in her video, Why Some Readers Still Struggle with Books About Non-White Characters, it's 2025 and apparently a black girl being sad is still unrelatable unless she is explaining the entire African diaspora while being sad. It also leads to white readers expecting to be handheld through cultures with which they are not familiar, where everything is explained in detail, all words translated and all cultural practices over-explained. And even then, as with Babel, we might not get it, might say we can't relate to the characters. Authors of colour experience the same thing as political commentators of colour or journalists of colour, expected to be a stand-in and representation for their entire race, teaching white people about historical trauma and far-flung wars and colonialism, and defending absolutely every other member of that same community. As Castillo again said, we expect those writers to provide those intellectual commodities in the way their ancestors once provided spices, minerals, precious stones, and unprecious bodies. It is this assumption and entitlement to trauma that has led to online hashtag movements such as Black Girl Magic and Black Boy Joy, pushing for black people and other people of colour being able to express their fully rounded, universally human self. This same instrumentalising comes up whenever a black person is murdered by the police, or a settler colonial entity commits genocide against a people, and a list of books are shared online again and again. Read and educate yourself, or at least perform as if you are, and all is good. Once again, I am not innocent of this. Part of the blame from this comes from the online idea adjacent to reading is politics, that posting is politics. If you are seen to not be posting, you will also be criticised for that. With Cindy talks about this in her video about her political activism offline being accused of not being political online. And comedian Deborah Francis White talks about someone coming into her DM and saying fuck you for not posting about Palestine, when she had multiple podcast episodes that were fundraising for Palestine, interviewing Palestinian people. Because what you see online is not the limit or even the pinnacle of most people's politics. And also political posts are suppressed. But I think that both can be true at once. We can feel the pressure to post about all political situations so that people can judge what side we are on publicly. And people can be posting as the beginning and the end of their politics. Neither of those is good or helps anyone. As I've already said, reading is political, but it is not politics. And any action, it needs to be taken outside of the small bubble of yourself in your room or even online. One smaller issue that I have from the idea that reading is an empathy building exercise is the sense of judgment and hierarchy that comes from such an idea. As if readers are uniquely or especially empathetic people. I have seen people talk about this in my comments when I say, like, I don't care if people are reading or not. And they're like, oh, well, you should care about reading and readers are better. And I find it kind of gross. Not a particularly empathetic perspective. Some people struggle to read. Some people simply don't like reading. And even if it were true that reading could build empathy, there's no one saying that it is the only way to do it. I find the readers are better than everyone else online discourse so very tiring. I think it perhaps has something to do with technological change. New genres and mediums that evolve are often seen as initially frivolous, then dangerous, then artistic. Novels themselves were seen as damaging to young women's minds and a waste of time. Television was the moral panic du jour of the 60s to the 80s, but then you have critically acclaimed hit television series and prestige television, and it becomes an art form. As one of the older, still existing mediums, novels have done this journey a long time ago, and so are perhaps more firmly rooted in art than other mediums. The hierarchy then extends to what kind of books are you reading? As I said, with the scientific research saying that empathy is built more from literary fiction than genre fiction. But I am sure that there are many genre fiction readers who would argue that there are examples of their genre that have complex, nuanced characters and difficult social situations, and you can't base a judgment of a whole section of reading based on 6 small passages. Of course, it is genres that are associated with women that get the shtick for this the most, and when women enter a genre, it slips down the hierarchy. But I find all of this judgment so boring. Like, who cares if you read or play video games or garden or play volleyball? Why is everyone so keen to prove that their hobbies make them better than other people? Stop it! And I'm not saying that reading does nothing and is no different from other hobbies. I am saying different does not mean better. Does not make you a better person. I read a lot. I read mostly literary fiction, despite what the men who comment on one particular video of mine seem to assume. And I have got a lot from reading. As Alan Bennett wrote in The History Boys, the best moments in reading are when you come across something, a thought, a feeling, a way of looking at something, which you had thought special and particular to you. Now here it is, set down by someone else, a person you have never met, someone even who is long dead, and it is as if a hand has come out and taken yours. I think everyone should have the chance to experience that. It is a powerfully moving experience. Salman Rushdie said, "Man is the storytelling animal, the only creature on earth that told itself stories to understand what kind of creature it was. The story was his birthright and nobody could take it away." I would argue the story is also her birthright, but I think we read stories because we are human, not to make us more so. Reading can educate you in a literal sense. You can learn things from books, and I think that is good. What you do with that education, however, has much more to do with you than it does with the book itself. Reading is a solo, selfish act, one in which we disengage with the people around us to commune with the words on the page and to go inwards. Introspection and self-learning can come from reading and can be a positive thing, even if in this individualistic culture in which we live, I think it is put on slightly too high a pedestal. That is an argument for a different day. I am not here to argue that there is no power in books, just that the power is personal, limited, and what you make of it. As Elaine Castillo said in her book, How to Read Now, the problem is, if we need fiction to teach us empathy, we don't really have empathy. Because empathy is not a one-stop destination. It's a practice, ongoing, which requires work from us in our daily lives, for our daily lives, not just when we're confronted with the visibly and legibly other. When I first started writing this essay, I did not expect it to be the longest one on my channel, so thank you very much if you've made it here to the end. If you are new here, my name is Roisin, and I would love to discuss this further with you in the comments, so please do leave your thoughts down below. And I will see you again very soon. Bye-bye.